Live service games are the new big thing according to AAA publishers, and whether that's true or not, we're in the middle of a boom in that subgenre. More specifically, we're seeing lots of online loot shooters, henceforth referred to as schlooters, because when I hear the word schlooter, I get the same grossed out feeling as whenever some AAA publisher decides it's time to birth another one of these things. And so it's EA and BioWare's turn with Anthem. But will it be Anthem's destiny to rise above the rest of its division? Let's find out. Anthem takes place on an unnamed planet which is regularly threatened by ancient and unstable technological artifacts left behind by a mysterious precursor race known as the Shapers. These Shaper relics, left unchecked, can manipulate the titular Anthem of creation, causing chaos in the form of wild terraforming and creature mutation. One such relic, known as the Cenotaph, was at the center of a cataclysm years ago, bringing an end to many freelancer pilots in the process. Players take up the role of one of the survivors of this incident, usually just referred to as Freelancer, and the story picks up when the evil Dominion forces make a play for this powerful and highly unstable relic. It's hard to come away from Anthem without being a little bit disappointed in its narrative. The plot itself is fine if a little generic, but it's primarily told through static conversations with uninteresting characters. And though there's a lot of lore to dig through if you so choose, not much of it is actually relevant. There are a lot of cool ideas here, from the psychically inclined ciphers who assist Javelin pilots remotely, to the legendary faction known as the Legion of Dawn, but the narrative really doesn't do anything with any of it. And instead of feeling like a participant in this tale, I felt more like a spectator. I don't feel like I'm exaggerating either. There is such a huge disconnect between the active gameplay sections of Anthem and its narrative, and it isn't long before every mission starts feeling exactly the same, but with different dialogue options being filtered through your comms as the only real distinguishing feature to tell you, hey, this mission is totally different from the last 5. Now, it's hard enough to get invested in Anthem's plot when the gameplay and story feel like they're on opposite sides of a solid steel wall, but it doesn't help that the characters who exposit to you when you're back at home base are either unlikable, boring, or both. It also doesn't help that every conversation, no matter who you're talking to, feels incredibly awkward. Each character's lifeless eyes just stare directly into your soul as they awkwardly gesticulate, and there's something about their mouth movement that is just so off-putting. But like I said, even if the conversations didn't feel super weird, there are only 1 or 2 characters that have any redeeming qualities, while the dialogue itself relies on Anthem's extensive lore without trying to establish any of it with the player to begin with. And despite all this extensive lore, the setting of Anthem felt lacking in personality, featuring a world that, while gorgeously realized, just doesn't feature much to keep it from feeling generic. The playable zones swap between the lush forest overworld and dank cavern dungeons, and despite both being littered with Shaper architecture, it all feels like something I've seen in a million games before this. And this isn't helped by the variety of enemies that Anthem throws against you, which include bland factions of insectoids, human outlaws, and the uninspired evil empire, as well as giant space bugs and other underwhelming wildlife. I tried my absolute hardest to engage with Anthem's world, but it was incredibly difficult because it just felt like a bland sci-fi slurry made of overused tropes without any soul of its own. Thankfully, I did find Anthem's core mechanics engaging, although the repetitive mission structure does the game no favors. Most missions will have you wiping an area clear of enemies, or retrieving items that need to be brought back to a single location, or even retrieving different items that need to be brought back to a different single location, except now you can't fly. And thanks to Anthem's inability to weave its narrative into the gameplay, I often found myself thinking that I was just repeating missions by accident. But I did actually enjoy playing the game, for the most part. The Javelin suit is a really cool gimmick, allowing you to fly and hover in addition to the usual third-person shooter fare, though I will say that I feel like more could have been done with the flight mechanics. Being tied to an overheat meter is an interesting way to force players to plan their flight paths around water sources, but I'm not sure why the flight isn't simply unlimited. It doesn't feel overpowering, and it's certainly the aspect of the game that drew me in most to begin with. The lack of any sort of mid-flight combat also feels like a missed opportunity, instead only letting players hover at a relatively low speed if they want to engage in mid-air combat. But at the very least, I did find that each Javelin encouraged vastly different playstyles, which was a welcome surprise. My initial choice was the hulking Colossus, so you'll notice an abundance of Colossus footage in this video. And it was so damn satisfying just bringing out its massive shield and charging into groups of enemies, or laying down explosive fire while drawing enemy fire away from teammates. The Speedy Interceptor was similar, in that I'd find myself in the thick of enemies using quick melee strikes and abilities, but also very different as it lacked the armor of the Colossus and required smart use of its triple jump and triple dash to stay out of danger. Completely different was my time with the Storm, which involved lots of hovering above the fighting, raining down elemental attacks and defensive shield walls. The only javelin I didn't get a real feel for was the Ranger, which is your basic all-rounder. Not great at any one thing, but perfect for beginners to pick up while they wrap their heads around the basics of flight, hovering, and using your abilities, so not a bad choice either. Now, beyond the actual javelins themselves, I think Anthem's use of abilities is what kept things entertaining for me. It's all well and good to run around shooting, but while those controls are functional and feel good to use, at the end of the day, a gun is a gun. And Anthem is woefully lacking in weapon variety. But the abilities you can equip on your javelin are not only super gratifying to use, the cooldowns on them are so forgiving that you're almost encouraged to use them as often as possible. Whether you're raining down lightning or elemental explosives as the Storm, or blasting foes with mortar and railgun strikes, these abilities feel so good to use effectively, and for the most part the game is pretty forgiving when it comes to aim assist for the more finicky skills. There's even a system that lets you combine elemental effects into combo attacks, adding a greater reason to play with others, but the game only ever makes a passing reference to it. That means that I, like many others, stumbled into this feature dick first, before needing to mess around with skill combinations before I had it all worked out. The game does a terrible job of conveying anything most of the time, and even its mission launch screen is incredibly confusing the first time you load into it. Making matters far worse, at its core Anthem is a schluter, but barely any of its loot feels special or worthwhile. As I briefly mentioned, there aren't a lot of guns available. 3 variations of each type, and about 9 or so types in total, making for roughly 27 standard guns in the game. And when it all breaks down to 1 being stronger with a slow rate of fire, 1 being weaker with a high rate of fire, and 1 in the middle of the road for power and rate of fire, then it's hard to get invested in the loot game. Beyond guns, there are alternate abilities and minor boosts that are so incremental it's hard to notice their effect in-game. So again, nothing that makes me want to play just for the loot. Worse still is the lack of cosmetic loot that doesn't have to be bought with exorbitant amounts of in-game money or, microtransactions. And even then, the most I've seen for any one class is 3 armor types. The base armor, 1 alternate, and 1 that needs to be on sale for you to be able to buy it. The coolest part of Anthem, its javelins, is kneecapped by a severe lack of customization. There is some extensive color options, but beyond that, there's nothing to aim for, nothing to get excited about along the way. Speaking of nothing to get excited about, Anthem's endgame at time of writing is pretty barren. You unlock repeatable contracts as well as 2 raid-esque stronghold missions, making for a total of 3 all up, and there's always free roam, but that's kind of it. The game lays a bunch of challenges on you, but none of it is super enticing, and Anthem already forces you to complete arbitrary challenges midway through the campaign to continue, so I was all out of effort to spend on that shit by the time I got there. Finally, it would be crazy of me to talk about Anthem without mentioning its unstable network features, frequent and lingering load times, and other issues. I found that it was common to wind up disconnected from Anthem's server over a dozen times in a single session of play, even while playing solo, and when playing with others the lag was practically always noticeable. But no matter how you play the game, you're bound to spend an inordinate amount of time staring at the game's loading screens, which lack any sort of lore excerpts or information or anything interesting that could potentially save that time from being wasted. Furthermore, I found that the game would stealth crash or disconnect behind these loading screens more often than not, meaning that I'd have to sit through a long load, get booted to the home screen, and then have to sit through the load again. And then there are the smaller issues, missions not triggering cutscenes properly, enemies falling through the world, and the not so small issue of hard crashes that can potentially brick your PS4 if that's your chosen console. As much as I hate to say it, Anthem is bad. Don't get me wrong, I like aspects of Anthem a lot, but it is hard to be passionate about it when you don't know what the fuck is going on because the narrative is so uninspired, or you don't have any real goals because all of the in-game loot is crap, or there isn't much to do outside of the lackluster campaign because the endgame is something to be built on for later, not for the launch window. Did someone say roadmap? Fuck live services. You only get one first impression, and Anthem does not make a good one.